go. Well, almost final morning of classes at least, of normal classes. Let's hope we don't crash and burn now. So I'm going to talk about random stuff. That's my life, that's what I do. And basically, from the first or the second lecture, let's say, until yesterday, we've gone through more and more complex stuff. And we've reached the question of, basically, do we need to know every possible detail? That was a lot of what we discussed yesterday night also, or how do we know every detail? And how do we know which ingredients are important to put in or not? These kind of questions. And what I'm going to talk about today is a bit of a perspective on that. I have lots of material, but we really don't have to go through all of it. I would rather start discussions and stuff, so please intervene if you want. Just first I will do a kind of intro, so don't discuss now. Basically, the question I want to ask is, if you accumulate many ingredients, is it guaranteed that the system necessarily behaves in complicated ways? And the first option, which we see a lot in biology, is that the answer is yes. That if you go look at the gene regulation network that controls your development, pretty much every detail matters, and if you do it's also true for presumably neural systems and all sorts of things. Like each gene has a role that's fully identified, and all are kind of deeply interconnected, correlated, and so on and so forth. The consequence of that is that if you move a single detail out of place, potentially you can impact the whole system in a very major way. For instance, you can get a fly to grow, actually flies spontaneously grow legs instead of antennas because of a flip in one of those developmental genes. So it's really like a single gene, like a modification of a single base pair actually gets you to have a completely random impact on the whole organism. It's not always the case, thankfully. But in systems that are like that, basically, there's basically no option short of really trying to understand all those details. And it's a bit annoying for ecosystems because no matter how much we try, we'll never know them as well as we know metabolic network or gene network. And even knowing metabolic or gene network is already very hard. So maybe the world is like this. That would be annoying. Another option, which is the option that has been pushed a lot by theoretical ecology since its start, is to say that you have a bunch of things happening in your system, but in fact, a few of them are much more important than everything else. For instance, you have keystone species, you have a keystone mechanism, like maybe predation is really what is important here, and you can ignore the non-trophic effects or sexual selection, behavior, dances that bees do, whatever. And you can focus on this key mechanism or key species or key ingredient. The problem with that is, we do our best with that. Everybody does that, I do that too. But it really has its limits. Like, this is considered a strong relationship, but it really doesn't explain a lot of the variance here between, let's say, nitrogen and plants or algae abundance. Likewise, people talk a lot about trade-offs surfaces between various strategies. This is the famous leaf economic spectrum. So it's a huge success in tree ecology or plant ecology to understand that various trees fall on a trade-off between various properties of leaves, but you still have a lot of variance around the trends. So clearly we're not capturing everything. And finally, as Yuval was mentioning in lecture 3, we see those cycles, those cascades, those trade-offs in some systems, those things that we can understand with key mechanisms. But clearly, it's not like there is a simple law that always holds, as far as you can tell in ecology. So you can think that those key mechanisms, you can think of it as tools in your pockets, such that if you encounter something in the world, you can use those various tools and try to see if it helps you understand the world. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. It's a very useful way to do science. But we might want to understand a bit more about the variance around also. And so, yeah, to summarize, we have like the situation of true complexity, which is you need all parts, and you have the situation of classical simplicity, I would call it, which is that you need to a system where there are some key mechanisms that where few things that really matter. And I want to ask if those are really the only two options, and I guess you'll guess from the title of the talk that there are other options, at least one, probably more. The one I want to talk about is what I would call emergent simplicity. I don't like the word emergent usually because nothing emerges or everything emerges. It's very confusing. But I'll use it here because I think it does convey one idea. It's important, I think. Which is usually a reflex is to think that things are simple when they're small. If there are only 2 species or 3 species, it's simple. If there are many species, it's complicated. In fact, I would criticize it a bit because one species is already very complicated. It's not like we're starting from atoms that are actually simple. But sure, we could still hope that 2 species is simpler than 1,000 species. In fact, it is possible to have situations in which a system with many variables will behave in simple ways. And this notion of complexity with simple consequences, that's really what we mean by randomness. That's what defines or what can be modeled by randomness. And I will try to sell you on this notion, because it's a bit of a weird notion. Now, to be honest, I don't really believe that ecosystems are random, and I don't believe that they're simple in the key mechanism way either. I think they're neither of those, but both are reasonable starting points, and I think it's useful to have both in your pockets, not only the chains and cycles and cascades, but also the prediction for randomness, so that you can use the 2 of them to try to really target what is happening in the system. That's the end of my introduction. You can intervene from now on. So the first thing I want to talk about before I go into the whole random business is what are we trying to predict when we use these things? Well, what even can we predict or try to understand? So as soon, one good natural place to start to think this way about the simplicity of complex systems is in macroecology, in the ecology of big patterns, because then obviously we have many species, we're looking at things that are about many species, and we lose focus on individual species. In this kind of pattern, we don't try to predict what happens to the beaver in Lake Omega, whatever, I like Lake Omega. We try to, because we believe in some sense that at the scales that we care of, or in the way that we care about them, there are lots of impacts. We do not really know what is happening. What we do instead is we can look at many species patterns, such as this species area relationship that we saw before, and other aggregate properties. And we can try to see if we can say something about them. So for instance, from lecture 4 on coexistence, it appeared clearly that one thing that we do want to understand broadly in the world is first diversity of species, and second inequality among them, but also inequalities in space. Like why is the world so darn heterogeneous, like in all sorts of ways. And so we will try to quantify this with all sorts of distributions, of statistics, and so on and so forth. But there's also dynamical properties at those large scales. So far we've talked about dynamics mostly at small scales. The dynamics of a large ecosystem, conceptually, they're not so different from the dynamics, like the kind of things that could happen are not so different from the kind of things that could happen for a few species. Maybe you will have one clear equilibrium. Maybe we'll have one clear directional trajectory, like succession. We have not talked so much about this, but let's say it's classical that you could imagine that there is a succession of stages in your ecosystem. You'll hear more about this in the next lecture, actually. And another possibility, which we hinted at, is the idea that you're not at equilibrium, but you're not directional either. In that case, I would call that a kind of stationary non-equilibrium, typically, like cycles, chaos, these kind of things. Things are moving all the time, but the distribution is kind of constant. If you have a cycle, things are moving all the time, but they're still in the same range. And if you aggregate over time, you have a well-defined histogram possible abundances. So those are the kind of behaviors that basically we would like to be able to identify and predict. general in systems. You could ask, okay, why would we care about those patterns or those kind of patterns? And I guess the main reason why historically we've cared about them is that various patterns have been proposed as fingerprints of various ecological scenarios. When we try to understand the big community, we try to think in terms of scenarios and what patterns could reveal, what fingerprints would reveal those scenarios. For instance, in microbiome studies, there are lots of species, so it's very hard to understand what's happening in detail. But it's common to think that there is a core microbiome that is really important, and then there's a bunch of microbes that are just peripheral. They happen to be here one day because that day you ate lettuce and there was some, something in the lettuce, but it doesn't matter in the long term. So we want to somehow separate the microbes that matter from the microbes that are just randomly there. And the kind of thing that we could look at to try to predict this is look at the covariances between abundances of the various species. And here, like blue, here would be low covariance, and light colors would be high covariance, and we would think that if species are part of the core, they will often be there together, or they will really interact strongly, so they will oppose each other strongly, so we could also have strong negative covariance. Whereas if species are part of the periphery, they're there a bit at random, and therefore, on average, they don't covary with anyone else. They're just there one day, maybe not. And so a pattern like this would be a sign potentially of core and periphery. Yes?
I have a question about that. So don't you have the same issue as the SDMs and things like this, where if you have competitive exclusion, then you have no covariance?
Yeah, so in a way, like, the reason why people are assuming that this makes sense, is they tend to think of the microbiome as much more of mutual, like cross-feeding and so on and so forth. So you would think that actually positive associations come from positive interactions, and everything that is negative would be more on the edges. Okay, sure, we know that the microbiome can keep away some invaders, but we think that's not the most important of what is happening here. But of course, it's a premise, right? It's a hidden assumption in the method that no one is really saying explicitly. So that's why it's a bit dangerous. Another microbiome example, it's common to think that there are, in your network, there are some functional clusters, like all the red species do roughly the same thing, all the blue species do roughly the same thing. And then the claim is that if you look at data, here each line is a different kind of frequency distribution of different species. If you look at the species, it seems that they're very different in every community. But if you group them into who does the basic reduction of carbon, who does the basic respiration, and so on and so forth, those things are much more stable. So here it's a situation in which you take data on species, you group them in some way, and you get much stabler data in some sense. And you decide, okay, that's a fingerprint of function. And again, there's lots of assumptions in here. For instance, we're not even asking, if I group species at random, I would get something more stable, probably, than individual species. So am I actually doing better than that? It's not clear. A third type of scenario and fingerprint is the intuition that diversity does something, that somehow all the species contribute to something, maybe collectively. That's a very vague and wavy notion, usually. And therefore, that if we increase the number of species, function will increase. Of course, again, usually, like initially, this was thought in a very collective spirit that, you know, all the species need each other and therefore they will all perform better if they're all there. But it could be a completely individual thing where if you increase species number, then you will by chance get the better species. So again, this fingerprint is not necessarily a clear fingerprint. That there are still more assumptions being hidden when we try to use those patterns as fingerprints. And so that's really what I wanted to say with this slide, is that it's very rare that a single pattern is really a smoking gun for a scenario. Like usually, as I now showed, there are billions of ways to fit or to obtain the same pattern, individual pattern. So typically, the thing that we will try to go to in this talk and methods that have been popping up for the last 20 or 30 years insist more and more on the idea that, first of all, the basics of everything is you need to be able to predict multiple patterns and not just one, to actually capture something that is a bit more likely to identify the right scenario. That's the first worthwhile points. Now, when the way that people have, a different way that people have thought, is to say, instead I could say, I start from my scenario, I model my scenario, and I want to see if that scenario produces that pattern, and I want to know if the scenario was important to produce that pattern. And the way I do that is, so I model my scenario, and then I look at my pattern, let's say this is a abundance distribution, and to know if that structure or that mechanism was important, I try to randomize the scenario to remove the key thing and see if it still gives the same prediction or if it gives a different prediction. If it still gives the same prediction, then it's likely that the structure was not actually important. Like a random version of the same model would have given the same result. So it kind of indicates that this pattern here is not a very good fingerprint for this thing, since it could be obtained in a different way. Now, I would contend that even if the randomization gives a different result, it doesn't tell you exactly what about what we did here was important. And it's not guaranteed that you did randomization in the right way. So it's not necessarily clear what's the fair comparison when you're randomizing. But still, it's a method that's very common. Like in Matthew Leibel's talk, he mentions Jared Diamond, who was trying to see traces of competition in the distribution of species across islands. And the way that people tried to refute it was by taking the same data table, trying to randomize the entries, and seeing if they got the same statistics. And they claimed that they did. So it was already an application in the 70s of this principle. And it has only gone here.
I'm trying to put this example in the context of your two so-called extremes, right? Of the something simplicity and emergent simplicity. Of the, what? Like, is a null model an emergent? Like you're saying, if the null model reproduces the same pattern, then really what we had in both cases is emergent simplicity.
I'm going to argue something along those lines. But I'm not there yet. But what I will claim is that here randomness is just an idea for how to have a null model. I haven't claimed anything more about randomness. I haven't said that it's anything special. It's just a way to generate a null hypothesis.
If you say that if the pattern obtained after randomization is not the same, then the structure may be important, but not for sure.
Not for sure.
Then, well, this is for very shocking, but okay.
Okay.
By the way, on the other hand, if you obtain the same pattern, then is the same structure may not be important, but can also be important. So.
Okay, so sorry, I need to define what I mean by importance. I mean importance to predict this pattern specifically.
Yes,
Right? Like, in a sense, okay, I would say that this structure is not more convincing than randomness as an ingredient for this pattern at least. It might be better than other structures, of course. Like maybe an inverted structure where you have a lot at the top and little at the bottom would have a completely different pattern. So this structure is still a way of obtaining this pattern, a valid way of obtaining this pattern. But if it's not doing better than randomness, we can argue that at least it's not, we have not identified the key structure here. It is one possible structure, but yeah. Thank you for the, and yeah, I'll try to give arguments for why the second one, the one that was tricky to you. If I forget about this, please ask me again. So the problem with randomness, well actually that's a bit here. The problem with randomness is that here I put an arrow and I said randomize as if it was clear what it means to randomize. But whenever you start to use randomness, like really innocent looking details about how you use it can have huge impacts on your pattern. So I shouldn't, like the floor is shaking when I step. It's too much for my core. I'll try to be unmoving from now. So I guess what I want to try to give you in this lecture, as much as you might care, is do we have some idea of if there's a principled way to use randomness? And also, here I equated it to null models, but is it really all that it is for, or what it means? And I'll go through a few examples of how it has been used before I try to give you more conceptual ideas about principles. So yeah, I'll go through a few examples of models with randomness by, let's say, from the most probabilistic, random, no mechanism, no ecology supposedly, to more and more mechanism supposedly. So the most basic you could do, I would call them like pure probabilistic models. The idea behind it, so it's a paper, I have the reference, oh, I forgot the reference here, sorry. It's a paper by Jacopo Grilli. What the paper does is take data from lots of microbiome communities. And here it's different samples from different guts in this case, but he has other data sets. So each column is a different gut, and each line is the frequency of various species across the communities. And the intuition that we have is that this is the full data, in principle, like the abundance of every species in every place in the world. And any pattern that we care about is some kind of simplification or aggregation of this. Like for instance, I could look within one row. I just do a histogram of that row and I have the species abundance distribution. So I forget about who precisely has each abundance, I just do a histogram. I could look at sorry, that was a column. So one column. I could look at one row and look across the row. One species across different communities, how much does its abundance fluctuate? So for instance, does it tend to always be rare, to always be common, or to go from rare to common in different communities? I could also take for each line its mean and its variance, and have now just a row of mean abundance or mean frequency and variance of frequency. And now I would have a distribution of mean abundance at the regional scale. And I would have, if I look at mean versus variance, I have something called Taylor's law, which is how the variance depends on the mean. It's a classic thing that people look in data. I'll show it in a second. This is here, actually, so forget the text for now. This is Taylor's law, so average abundance versus variance of abundances. That's a pattern. And here, the various colors are different types of data sets, like soil microbiome, gut microbiome, glacier microbiome.
Yes. What's ABT?
That's just, he called it abundance fluctuation distribution. It's just the fluctuations of one abundance across communities. So the claim of this paper is, first of all, that if you look at those quantities, in many data sets, in his case, they appear to really behave the same, which is an interesting pattern. That's this kind of universality that Luria was talking about, is the theory about networks. Here, there seems to be some kind of universality in at least those data sets. As a disclaimer, people have tried to reproduce it in other data sets. It's not so clear that it always holds as well in those. But at least as a principle, matter of principle, it's not unreasonable.
So when you say that, you mean specifically in this kind of communities that they tried to reproduce and didn't work, or in
also in macro, like in non-microbiome things, in different microbiomes, in different levels of sampling.
so it's very
Yes. And I would guess the general idea holds more or less, but it's rarely as clean as this. Not to accuse Jacopo of cherry picking. I think he found data on which it worked, and I would not expect that he explicitly tried to delete all the data in which he didn't. But I would say that there's no reason for this to be that perfect, but I do think that for it to work in already 12 different data sets, or 10, or I don't know, it suggests that there is something there that is actually a bit robust.
Can you explain what work means here?
Yes, so what I mean by work is this. What he claims is, forget about the detail of who is in which community and who has which abundance. All I need to care about is first, what is the mean, the distribution of mean abundances. So some species, it's a half log normal basically. Some species are very abundant across all the communities. Some species are very rare across all the communities. That's their average basically. Now, if you look at fluctuations around that average, if you take each species, no matter how abundant they are, and you look at fluctuations across communities around that average, they have basically the same type of fluctuations. So it means that no matter whether you're rare or abundant, how much you fluctuate from community to community is essentially the same curve. Here I would just note that the fact that the data sets collapse perfectly is a bit of, it's not a trick, but it's a rescaling because they have different variances in fact. But he has a single variance parameter per data set. And so it's not, it's still quite impressive. Like, there are lots of different species here, and once you just rescale by kind of intrinsic variance of the whole data set, they fall on the same curves effectively. So why would glacier microbiome or soil microbiome be intrinsically more variable than others? It's not clear. But at least, well, I think I have the table of, yeah, that's his table of parameters per data set. And there is some variation that is not always trivial, but it is like, he has one parameter per data set, so it's already a strong reduction of the information there. And so the claim that is made in this paper by Jacob is that since those patterns are so strong, we can actually use them to think about the other patterns. Maybe these patterns predict other patterns that you could look at, in the sense that if I forget about the details of my data here, and I just randomly generate species according to this law, their mean abundance according to this law, then their fluctuations around the mean according to this law, and using this variance mean relationship, then I would be able to create fake data here, and I will look at other patterns in this fake data, and they would be the same as the pattern in the real data, which hopefully I show, yes. So that's what I'm saying here. He just says that all you need to know about this data is the overall, the variation between locations and the variation of the mean.
Without explaining where he gets that, right? That's just a given.
That's just fitting. So he gets, oh, so you mean the relationship?
For the model, like you just assume that
Yeah.
comes from somewhere, we don't know where, we don't care, given that.
Exactly, thank you, that's exactly the idea here. So it's really a probabilistic model in the sense that I have no idea which mechanism created those distributions. I just assume that this is what they are. I take them from the data, I fit their values, and now I generate more data from it to see what it gives me. And one example where he shows that he can reproduce other data is he looks at something which is effectively the range distribution of each species, like quote unquote, which is in how many samples are species present or absent. And the x-axis is the real data and the y-axis is the generated data. And there is no difference between the two. And he takes that as an evidence that competition is not apparent in these data sets. Because if competition was strong, then you would expect some species to be absent more than randomly, because they're excluded by competition. Here, he just generates species abundances like independently of each other, as if species were not interacting, and he gets the same prediction in terms of presence absence, and he would than he gets in the data. So that allows him to claim that it's effectively a model of a stationary distribution. There is no dynamics here. Species are not equal in fitness because you have this very log normal, this very wide distribution of average abundance. By the way, this is all in log scale, so this is 2 orders of magnitude. Some are 100 times more abundant than others on average. So different species fitnesses, although like across the whole data set, and no interaction between species, just independently drawn and put in the world. That's enough to predict various things. It's not the only pattern he looks at. He looks at 5 other patterns, and he makes a convincing argument that they all are well predicted. Yes.
Yes, but I mean, if the parameters of the equation,
Yes.
if those don't have an isoc index, so those are for each biome,
Yes.
then why do you expect the species to have different fitnesses? I would expect a neutral model.
So that's actually a fun point. Here, the assumption is that, I mean, you could see this in 2 ways, right? One possibility here is that there is a log normal distribution of average abundance because species, I mean, there is a, let's say, x average I, index I. Now it's drawn from a random distribution, but it is, once it's drawn, it's set. Like a species is a good species or a bad species or an abundant species or a rare species, and that's true all across the data set. But it could be, indeed, that this is not fitness, that it's just a self-reinforcing process. Like maybe that the abundant species is not fit, it was just more lucky initially, and it dispersed more. And now it's very abundant, but not by being better intrinsically, just by winning early on, which is the idea of neutral theory. I'll go to neutral theory later. But that's exactly the kind of points that I think are hidden in the assumptions that we're making here. There would be multiple ways to explain the same thing. Yes.
The question about the scales at which you can apply this kind of theory, because we could see in the data set that we have 20,000 species. So if you zoom out, like you get these patterns. But in the previous lecture, we were focusing only on a few species. So all this noise happening at the small scale gets like reduced at the large scale. So I was wondering, like, how sensitive is this to the size of your community, and if you subsample this community, would you get like similar patterns?
So even with subsampling quite a bit, it's not too bad. But one thing that is very true in what you're saying is like maybe the reason why people have a hard time applying his exact method to animals or plants or like large scale things is every sample here of the microbiome, it's the size of Australia for the microbes. I mean, it's, you know, like it's not maybe not even one community. In fact, it's maybe a whole meta community or a whole like world of meta communities in one sample. So it's not clear at all that we're talking about the same thing when we do an abundance distribution for a thing that is so large compared to the individuals versus when we do something that is in a local patch. Yeah, weather. So, as I mentioned, this model by Greeley and other ideas have been proposed like this before. There's Brian McGill has worked a lot on these kind of things too. It is an idea that at the end of the day, yeah, we can use random draws to generate a lot of the patterns that we see. And so that would at least be an important null model to not be too ambitious with our proposed mechanisms. Now, the problem with this is, okay, first, species are non-interacting. They are dissimilar on average, since they have different mean abundances. We could ask two things. The first thing is, here we had to fit a distribution. We had to go into the data to see that it's still normal. Could we have predicted what the distribution should be in principle in some way? The other question is it clear that what we see, this data comes from non-interacting dissimilar species rather than from strongly interacting identical species, which is the whole game of neutral theory. I think maybe for the sake of time, I'll probably skip a lot of this, but that's fine. We can talk about them later if you'd like. I'll just give you the general idea. So the idea of maximum entropy, I don't know if you've heard about maximum entropy theory of ecology, METE. There was a moment where it was popular, not so long ago. The claim is, of all maximum entropy approaches, they're still very probabilistic in the mind. We don't want to use a mechanism to decide what are the distributions that we're using. We want to kind of let the data choose the model. And I'll give you just the rough recipe is that if the only thing that you could measure in data is some statistics like average abundance, there is a well-principled thing in probability theory that is try to find the probability distribution that has maximum entropy given this information, which means what is the distribution that is the most random, given that it needs to have this specific average. And if you have more information, then you can put more information together and still try to find the most random distribution that still has those information, like maybe the mean and the variance, maybe the mean, yeah.
I hope I'm getting this correctly, but I'm suspecting that the point here is that here you're saying, okay, I can take one singular value,
yes,
the average, and from that get a whole distribution.
Exactly. Thank you.
I don't know if that's
no, that's a good point. Right. That instead of saying I have to go into data and fit my log normal to know that it's log normal and maybe it's a truncated power law or something, I say I have a principal way of deciding, which is if I can only measure the average, then my best guess will be the maximum entropy distribution for the average, like given the average. That would be my least biased choice, so the one that makes the smallest amount of implicit assumptions. So it's a kind of principle for how to use randomness. Do not pick a distribution just because you like it. Pick it because it is the one that is in principle the least biased for what you do. I will certainly not go into the details of how it works. But yeah.
Intuition of why that you want to maximize entropy? Any intuition at all? Like,
So the intuition, in a sense, is yes, there is. Okay, I'll get to it at the end, actually, because it's very connected to where randomness matters. So let's just say, for now, we accept that it's the most random, given the information we have. No, like other questions? Or whatever, it's a proposal, like I don't have to explain why it works. The only point I want to make about this maximum entropy approach is that it is very sensitive about now what you measure in the data. Because if you only measure the average abundance, then the maximum entropy distribution is the exponential distribution. If you only measure the average and the variance, then now it would be a Gaussian distribution. If you had measured the average of the log, which is the geometric average, or the log of the geometric average, then it would be a parallel distribution. So it feels like, you know, someone arrives with a method that tells you this is a very mathematical, deep method. It can, you know, you don't have to make any assumptions, you just look in the data and the data chooses the model. But now, depending on what you choose to measure in the data, you get a completely different model. So in fact, you should still be very careful. And I think that's the general trend I want to import here, which is in the scale of very probabilistic to very mechanistic arguments, the more you use probability type of arguments, you're still making assumptions, but they tend to be more hidden. They tend to be in places where you don't know where they are, if you don't really understand the probability model that you're using. And I think that's very true of statistics too. Typically, the more effort you put on the stats, the more likely it is that you're making some hidden assumption in your statistical model that actually you don't know about. And so that's why it's worthwhile to use them. Those are good tools. They're not magic bullets. It's not like they can do your work for you of thinking about your system. Yeah, so maximum entropy is not assumption free. I'll skip this part because it's fine. And I'll go to neutral theory. And I think after neutral theory, we'll take a break. So neutral theory is kind of the next step in that progression. We started from just sampling randomly distributions. Now, neutral theory is mostly probabilistic, but it has a little bit of a mechanism. What neutral theory is saying is, I have a zero-sum game. That's the premise of original neutral theory, which is I have a total number of individuals that is going to be just distributed amongst the different species. And what happens is, at every, species are identical in terms of traits. At each time step, I draw a random, like a random individual dies with probability D, like a probability of death. Any empty spot becomes a new individual of species I proportionally to the abundance of species I. So if a species is already very abundant, it's more likely to have a new offspring come and fill a spot. And with the remaining probability, just a new species appears. Like you have an empty spot, you want to keep the same total number of individuals. If someone died and no one was born, then it becomes a new species. This was proposed as models of forests. Actually, initially it was in evolution and population genetics, but then it was used by Hubble to talk about especially tropical forests, but forests in general, with this idea that the main dynamics in the forest is just gaps. Sometimes a tree will die, fall, whatever. There will be a gap, it will be filled by another tree. And the trees that are more abundant have more of a chance to occupy that spot. So, okay, it's a particular premise, and why not? And if you solve this model, it's a model that is simple enough that you can solve it more like completely. And roughly speaking, the abundance distribution is this shape here. So what does this look like? Maybe actually I should draw one thing in this whole lecture, and I'll draw it instead of this. This thing looks like effectively, the wrong pen. This thing looks like if this is abundance, and this is probability of abundance, it starts like, let's say in log scale. It starts like a line and then it's scaled. So it starts at the power law, 1 over x power law. And then when x is larger than 1 over a, there's just kind of exponential thing that comes and kills and means that you cannot be much larger than 1 over a in this case. So there's kind of maximum abundance set by system size or set here by actually the rates of birth and death. And before that you are a power law, and above that it's very rare to have someone who is much more abundant than that. Yes?
Why is it not a strict cutoff if any? Is it large n?
So actually, yeah, so here you need x to be much smaller than n, so you don't see the strict cutoff. So the typical abundance here will be actually like log of b over d. You choose those things so that it's very small compared to them. So in maximum entropy, what will happen is basically the method is supposed to tell you which distribution to use given what you measure, but you could choose to measure more and more things. And if you can imagine that if you put everything, all the information that you have in the maximum entropy model, it just tells you exactly like the model is identical to the data. Like basically, I think that's an important point actually. Thank you for allowing me to do that. What does it mean to do a distribution? Like doing a random distribution is saying, I care only about the histogram of this, I don't care about who has which abundance. But if in my maximum entropy model, I put the information of each correlation in the matrix, like for instance, this abundance goes to this species in that community, and I put all that information, and at the end my model is just identical to my data. There's no variation possible. In a sense, you could think of it a bit like, yeah, this is a hard thing to say properly. You could think of it as, yeah, using a distribution, using a probability distribution, is forgetting about labels of species, like who was the good one, who was the bad one, and so on and so forth, just having a graph like this. And every information I put back is more and more giving me information about the labels, because at the end of the day, there will be a single species that at the same time had this abundance here, and was also well correlated with this other species, and so on and so forth. I hope this answers your question, I'm not sure. So what I wanted to say about neutral theory is basically, okay, it makes a prediction. This prediction was fit to data. It was a reasonable fit. It was one of the many things that fits species abundance distribution in a reasonable way. It was also used to predict the other patterns I mentioned, like species, like occupancy, like fraction of sites in which you would see a species, and so on and so forth. I will not go through the technical details. And I think all I wanted to say is that, okay, is what I did want to say is that in fact this distribution here happens to be exactly the same one that Hart obtained with his maximum entropy, using some probabilistic arguments where he was saying what we measure are this and that properties in the data, and therefore I can get this distribution. So here we have a mechanism to get this distribution. In maximum entropy we had some kind of empirical arguments or probabilistic argument for why this should be it. And I wanted to convey this idea that basically here we get the same results by either going into mechanisms that will constrain which distributions are possible, or by making clever choices of what I should measure and applying some kind of broad argument. So it's not clear that maximum entropy or neutral theory are more agnostic one than the other. They're both making assumptions, and actually each can reveal a bit something about the assumptions that the other is making. The heart of what both are making, if I really boil it down to just a simple idea, it's really what matters is the second line here, which is deep down, the two of them are making a rich gets richer argument. which is that the way to get a realistic distribution, a bonus distribution, is to say everything is a bit random, species are not very special, but once they start getting richer than others, they will get even more and more and more rich, because the more abundant you are, the more likely you are to have new offspring. And so what this means at the end of the day is that the bonus distributions that we see, they might not necessarily reveal any real differences of fitness. It might just be the fact that if you start to win early, you will be very rich at the end of the process. I think that's also an important lesson for capitalism. But I will stop the political aspect of the lecture here. Yes.
And so does removing this assumption
Changes everything. If you remove this assumption, then you have Gaussian abundance distributions. There are no big winners, no big losers. Everybody has roughly the same abundance. So, yeah. And like how you get this rich get richer doesn't matter, right? It could, like the most obvious way is through reproduction, but it could be through some kind of dispersal advantage, through some very complicated mechanism. No matter which mechanism gives that, at the end, if you have this rich get richer and it dominates the abundance distribution, then you will get an abundance distribution that is like the ones that you find in tropical forests and the like. Yes.
Does it work well also for speciation? Because we can imagine that if P is really small, then you have a lot of like new species emerging.
Yeah. Yeah. So in fact, so here in this case, he was thinking of speciation, but you could think about it also as immigration from the outside. So you know you're in a microbiome, and very often I might have new species coming from the outside, and clearly the smaller the bee. I was visualizing a small bee. I'm tired. I apologize. So
It should have been much smaller on your slide.
so the smaller the bee, the smaller the. Wait, this is confusing because it's the log, and so this is going to be smaller than 1. Yeah, basically, the smaller the b, the smaller the 1 over a, and so all the abundances will be closer to 0 because you're in a system that is much more input driven, like things are coming from the outside or just doing speciating, and all the abundances are small. And few species have gotten all the way to being very abundant. And same thing, if D is very large, obviously, if things die all the time, then again, all of the abundances will be very small.
Why do you call it a shark? Because like to me, the shark would be more random.
I mean, it is random, right?
It's
Like,
random, but still with probability.
so, yeah, but species don't, like, no species is intrinsically more fixed. They all have the same birth and death rate, right? It's just that once you're there, once you already have a large population, then you will typically get more. Of course, in fact, it doesn't hold forever. It's not like there's enough randomness in the system that even if you're very rich for a time, at some point you will go down. But it's a very slow process. Like, it takes a lot of time for a rich to become poor again, because it takes many individual deaths. Like if you have gotten to 10,000 individuals and you need to go extinct again, you will need in a row to have many deaths and not so many births. So it happens by chance, but it's rare. Yeah, I think this is a good place to start for a break. Minute break. 5 minutes challenge.
Did you catch your breath at all?
tout cas, un seul tour des deux branches, ça va quand même assez rapidement, je pense. Non, mais ça, c'est pas mal. Mais oui, en fait, ça c'est globalement des structures particulières d'attracteurs comme ça, qui deviennent de plus en plus difficiles quant à la structure de chance que c'est juste une courbe d'algorithme qui en fait
Est-ce qu'il y a moyen de moi je fais des simulations avec moi, je sais pas 50 espaces et j'aimerais bien savoir quand est-ce que je les. Quand j'ai des signes. En fait, comment est-ce que je peux identifier si j'ai des signes quand c'est du code et s'il y a un moyen de faire.
À 50 espaces, honnêtement, je pense que c'est assez distinct. Aujourd'hui, tu fais un
C'est bon pour
no paper yet. It didn't work so well, but you can talk to people in the marathon.
Yes, I know, but I'm doing a research using
Okay. Then people in his group, you know, Jacopo used to be in his group.
Yeah.
People in his group have been trying to extend this to more data sets. I don't remember how exactly.
Yes, Samuel Suez. I'm working with him on that. So.
Okay, you're working with me on that.
Yeah, in the
So,
Twitter version.
Does it work?
Well, I will tell you
Yeah, that's true.
tomorrow.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, I'll restart. This will go Yeah, pretty much everyone can get. People who are not here just deserve to not be. That's not true. That's really not true. Anyway, so I want to end this, I was going to say comfortable stroll, but it's really like a forced march through random models. So this sprint through random models with a little bit of dynamics, just to give you an idea of the kind of things that can be done. But it's not the heart of what I want to say. It's just to let you know that, okay, all the models that we've been talking about until this point, they were either not dynamical at all, like maximum entropy or sampling, or they had very simple dynamics, like neutral theory. You just have a birthday process. There's nothing very fancy that can happen in dynamics. So it means that they're all kind of assuming that at the end of the day, a large community is in a kind of stationary state. It could be an equilibrium, like a completely fixed thing. It could be fluctuations. Well, it has to be fluctuations for some reason because we need randomness. But it doesn't tell us really where the fluctuations come from. Maybe they're from the environment, and so on and so forth. They don't answer at all the question of whether a large community is supposed to be stable, as we have discussed yesterday morning. And so typically the thing that we would want to do to kind of make those two approaches converge, like the neutral type of things, and everything that you've heard up until this point this week, is of course to take our best friends, Lotka and Volterra, and make them randomize them. Of course, again, it's not very wet to this specific model. Like you could take their cousins and it's fine. So, you will be tired to death of this equation, but I think it doesn't appear in your talk at least, Yuval, so yes. Actually it does. But so now the idea is that instead of knowing what the R and the Aij are, now we draw them at random. That's the simplest thing you could do to put randomness in there. And actually it's a model that you can completely solve too. It is not obvious. And what the things I want to point out about this model is a few things. The first one, I will show them in the next slides. The first one is it has a small set of really distinct dynamical regimes. Physicists would call that phases. That doesn't really matter. The point is that you could imagine that if you started to put random numbers in there, and you have many species, everything could happen, and it would be sensitive on all the parameters. In fact, you have a very few different, very qualitatively different behaviors that can arise from that. And I will show that. The second thing is that those behaviors and all the outcomes of this model are predicted by a small number of parameters. Like you would think if I have 1,000 species in my model, I have 1,000 values of R, and I have 1,000,000 values of A. In principle, everything could matter in there. In fact, only means and variances and covariances really matter, which is again not the case. Third thing is, those parameters that I just mentioned, they're not so well aligned, or not so obviously always aligned with intuitions that you would get from having looked at two species. They're not so far from it, but there is a bit of a difference here that I think is useful to keep in mind. So the first thing I want to say is about those aggregate parameters. So my second point here, that's a bit confusing with this, but it is. So the point is, if I look simply at the standard deviation of my R, so of the growth rates, the average interaction, standard deviation of the interaction, here I'm multiplying them by number of species for reasons that are may-like, but ignore that for now. And the correlation between AIJ and AJI, for some reason I would say those are four statistics I want to look at on my parameters. If I look at only those four statistics, I can predict the abundance distribution, no matter whether the model that generates those interactions is actually deep down a predation model, a resource competition model. If they happen somehow to fall onto the same statistics, then they will give the exact same predictions. So here, for instance, it was a model of random predation, so a bit of a mixotroph situation. Let's say everybody grows, everybody can eat others at random. There are various parameters in this model. This model can explore the orange region when I change the specific model parameters, such as trophic efficiency, these kind of things. But if I translate those parameters back down to just this simple model with only the R's and the A's, and I measure the stats, the mean and variance of those parameters, then a completely random model that has nothing to do with predation will give the same results, as long as it has the same statistics. Same thing here for the resource competition model. I have a model with explicit resources, explicit consumers, various parameters such as how many resources there are, strongly, how differently I consume them. Again, in many cases, almost like in many cases, all non-singular cases, I would say, this model will behave like a random model if there are many species, many resources. Yeah.
So here the color shape is like, is it like the feasibility shape, or is it like if it's falling, it can be done by random, and if it's not falling, it can't be done by random?
No, it's more like the first one. Actually, it's how far can you go by changing the parameters of that model. Like this model is written in a different way. Maybe I should have written it, but like you remember resource competition, like you have species and so on and so forth. When I changed the consumption rates of resource competition, I could not visit the whole space of possibilities here, because this creates a coupling between the average, the variance, the correlations, and so on and so forth. So each model is a bit restricted in the part of the space that it can explore. And this means that indeed, in general, a resource competition model will tend to give different results from a predation model, because it tends to fall in different places of the space. That part makes sense. But when they happen to be in the same part of the space, they give the same prediction, even though they're completely different mechanisms.
And I guess the only main thing is having high enough S.
High enough
I would say
S,
very high, but
yeah, high enough number of species, and that within those models, actually things are already a bit random. Like it's not like predation is a food chain. It's everybody could eat everybody in principle. Like if you have something that already kills details, then you can kill the last few details and it doesn't matter so much usually.
The limits of the regions of those statistics are imposed by you.
No, they're imposed by the model. Like the model cannot go visit those things here.
Why it's drawn at random? Not uniformly at random.
Sorry? What?
I mean, the parameters are drawn at random, but not uniformly at random.
They could be uniformly at random, but for instance, in predation, for instance, you could never have a positive correlation between the impact of prey on predator and predator on prey.
Yeah, but it's not just in zero, it's in
Yeah, so okay.
-0.3.
Here,
That's why.
yeah, okay. I think here, this thing is representative. I don't claim I went to the end of the world, but yeah, that's right.
So here we can see see where it can be represented by random semi-random matrices or not?
Actually, in this whole thing, it can be represented by random. It always works.
And when may it not work? Is there any place where?
Here it always works with those models. It wouldn't work if I put more structure in those models. Basically, if I started to have some special resources or a clear trophic structure in the prediction model, then randomness would start to break. But as long as I have not put special structures in there, in fact, the ecological details, the macro details don't matter. Maybe that's the better way to say it. Here, the difference between those models is at the species level. Is my interaction resource competition or is it prediction? But the broad structure of the model is actually random. What will matter to break randomness is broad structures, like having, at the scale of the whole community, 4 levels or something like this. That would deviate from randomness. And I will make these points actually at the very end. My talk would make it clearer. But one way that you can think about it is maybe it's worthwhile doing a drawing for this. It's not a hard thing to draw. It's, imagine that you have a bunch of species. And it could be that here every pair, is a bit special. But if the general, ocean of things is a bit random, it doesn't matter so much what you put in one pair or in one species. Like the randomness would kind of prevail over the local details if the whole is random enough.
I don't know. Studying physics, this is it's shells, gas, and stuff. But maybe it's worthwhile mentioning as well.
Yep.
That the intuition is.
Please shout gas.
Okay, I don't know. One of the classic results of statistical mechanics in physics is that you can ignore entirely everything you know about the gas, the type of gas, like the atoms and whatever, almost all the details. But because you have 10 to the power of 30 or whatever it is, atoms of gas, so many, then you lose all the details, the microscopic details, and you go back to a few macroscopic properties like temperature, pressure, things like that. And this is in a very similar notion, right?
Right, exactly. And so this is why I am regularly very mildly irritated when people say, make a random model and say something like predator-prey interactions are stabilizing or something like this. Because usually by predator-prey they mean a negative correlation here, but you could very well have a negative correlation with another model. It's not the nature of predator-prey that matters in their results. It's actually just the statistics that could be obtained by very different models. So, very different microscopic details. Here again, in the context of a large random system, like a system that is varied, otherwise quite random. I will try to ask after that, is this relevant to the real world in any way? That's a valid question. But at least for now, accepting that this is the world that we're playing with, I can say that. And yeah, the idea that's behind this, actually, like another example, apart from the gas, is really the central limit theorem. So why do you get Gaussians, like normal distribution, everywhere in the world? Is that if you have a bunch of variables, each variable could have its own law, they could all have different distributions from each other. As long as they're reasonably independent of each other, then the sum of those things just gives you a Gaussian. So it doesn't matter actually, this one is bimodal, this one is exponential. When there are many of them and we sum them, it doesn't matter. And so really what I'm showing here is just the same idea, but for interactions in the network instead of independent variables being summed. But the interactions are being summed in Terra. You have this sum over interactions. So that's why intuitively, if each of those terms is a bit independent of the others, then it should behave a bit like the central limit theorem, I guess. Yes.
Can you explain the process, like in knowing which aggregate parameter you should look at and how do you define your axis?
Yeah, it's hard. It's both easy and hard. Like, if you know that you're going towards something that is a bit Gaussian, then you know it's going to be means and variances and covariances. There's nothing else that should matter. Nothing else matters. But in general, you would need to solve the model. Like, it's basically you would need to write the equations, find an analytical solution to the model, and that solution would tell you what are the parameters that matter. Those are really, it's like, how do we know that when you do physics, thermodynamics, it's actually temperature and pressure that matter? It's not obvious in itself. You would have to I mean, you had to understand that. So what I meant to say with this thing is, it gives us a principal way to know what is the right null model here, in this case. If I do a structured Log-Cavotera model, let's say a food web, Log-Cavotera food web, and I want to know if my prediction is different from randomness, I should randomize, but I should randomize holding those things constant. If I randomize in a way that changes those things, then there's no reason that my comparison is fair. So basically, essentially keeping the same mean, variance, and symmetry in my interactions. Okay, so now at least we have supposedly a way to know in principle what is the right type of null model that you should do. I would note about dynamics, I mentioned that before, that this model, if you ignore the mutualistic divergence that we have talked about a lot, this model with random interactions, it has only basically three big behaviors it can have. One is if interactions, this is average interaction and this is standard deviation of interactions. If interactions are not too different from each other, you have a unique equilibrium. So things are stable, the world is peaceful. If interactions are more different from each other, you have chaos. So you start to get things that move a lot like this. So one thing that this means, and if interactions are all quite strong, if you start to have a lot of strong feedbacks, individual feedbacks, like not individual, but I mean strong feedbacks between pairs of species and so on and so forth, then you end up having a bunch of different equilibria, which means that your system can be trapped in various states. For instance, some competitor can exclude them, like priority effect. This is the region of priority effects. So basically, there are only three things that could happen: priority effects, everything is stable and gentle, even though some species can go to extinction, but they go gently to extinction, and chaos. And so I think that it's a nice picture to have because it tells you, in principle, if I go out in the world, I should be able to try to find fingerprints of only three or a few different things. There are not 10,000 different behaviors I could see in the world if this model is if this type of model is correct. So this priority effect regime is interesting for reasons that Yuval will talk about later. The chaotic regime here, this chaotic region, so when interactions are not too strong individually, the mean is not too strong, but they're quite different from each other. It creates very large fluctuations of abundances that tend to look quite a bit, so this is a simulation, that tend to look quite a bit like the kind of fluctuations you'd see in time series, and the kind of fluctuations that you would obtain also by having no interactions, but a strong environmental driving, like very strong environmental fluctuations. So what I want to say with that is that if you see a time series that looks like this, it could be noise from the environment forcing you, like environmental noise, like we talked about just mentioned yesterday, or it could be chaos intrinsic to the interactions. The species themselves are creating a chaotic environment in which they will try to invade and then eventually die and try to invade again and keep fluctuating like this. The final thing I want to say about random Log-Cavotera is actually neutral theory can be seen as a special case of random Log-Cavotera with noise. And if you do simulations, if you add here the term that is effectively noise from the outside, noise that doesn't come, like fluctuations that don't come from the interactions, but that come from either birth, death, or environment, or something like this, the stronger the noise, the more this model will behave like a neutral model. And this is shown here, like this is increasing the noise versus increasing the role of the interaction. And blue means it's very different from neutral, white means it's very similar to neutral in terms of abundance distribution. Joint abundance distribution, but that's a detail. So what I mean is that neutral theory doesn't have to be a separate world from the rest. It's just a limit case of the same world.
Does it matter which noise you use?
Sorry, what?
Does it matter which type of noise you use?
In vague ways. Like people have done, so the initial neutral theory is demographic noise, just birth-death process. People have done environmental neutral theory. Actually, Nadav Schnell does that. And it still behaves a lot like neutral theory. There are a few differences in the dynamics, but not in the status. Okay, I'm getting to the end of my class. Everybody can right? I just have now philosophy, which is whatever. Yes.
Can you comment a little bit? Something I always found disturbing is what they call local their niche model.
Yeah, I know. So, okay, very confusingly, people have started to claim that there is basically two big theories, like neutral and niche, and in ecological theory, that everything is about reconciling neutral and niche. And there is no reason why this should be called niche. This has no relationship at all to niche theory. It's just saying non-neutral, basically. It's just saying that species are different. So in fact, there is a double confusion because neutrality is like there are two aspects in neutral theory that are different from usual. One aspect is that species are identical. The other aspect is you're adding noise. And you could have identical species without noise. You could have different species with noise. Like all four possibilities, like again, that's a false dichotomy, right? A bit like bottom-up and top-down control. You could have all four possibilities of like identical with and without noise and different with and without noise. And so people have tried to kind of merge this into, there are neutral people who are identical species with noise and niche people who are different species, different fitnesses without noise. But that's a bit arbitrary.
Yes, personally, I remember being very confused because it sounded like there were people opposing niche and neutrality by saying that niche is when interaction matter and neutral and like niche has, like usually is not something to do with interactions.
Yeah. So that's again a bit like,
understand why people put this way.
I would say it's like a niche footwear model, you know? It has nothing to do with niches in the sense that we talked about in the first day, and I think that's just how it is.
As it's not opposing.
I'm sorry?
At least it's not like it's not a direct dichotomy.
Yeah.
Like the name one. Usually you hear both, so
Yeah. What can I say? People are confused or confusing both. Okay. So I've just filled your brain up to capacity, to carry capacity with random models, and now I want to take like the remaining 10 minutes or so to talk a bit about why is it even vaguely relevant to do any of this. Like, is it just nonsense? I'll start with philosophy, right? So what I want to say is that the very idea of randomness is this idea of complexity leading to simple results. That's not me inventing this, it's what we mean by random. There is nothing that is intrinsically random in the sense that everything in the world is, let's ignore quantum mechanics, but presumably everything in the world is kind of deterministic and has very complicated causes. I mean, things that have very complicated causes tend, if the causes are complicated enough, to have simple results. And of course, the classical example is a dice throw. Everything in the motion of dice is purely deterministic. There's no magical genie coming and pushing the dice in random ways. But because there are so many causes, the result is statistically very simple. So if the dice were less complex, I mean, if the causes of motion of dice were less complex, things would actually be not as simple in probability. Because this complexity leads to chaos, chaotic motion, and this chaotic motion leads to the dice exploring every possibility more or less equally. It doesn't always do that, but in this case, that's an archetype of, because there are many factors that influence the dice, then their movement is, at the end, their result is simple. And it's really kind of, I would call that, like, that's more of a computer science way of viewing things, but it's a kind of unexploitable complexity. No one can become the world's champion at throwing dice. When you throw a basketball, there is some randomness, there is some factors that you don't control, but there are factors, key mechanisms that you can control, which is typically throwing in the direction of the hoop, which do help your results, right? Whereas if you throw dice, there is nothing, actually, there is no key mechanism you can identify that is how you could act as a lever in the system. So this is why I put this a bit as the kind of polar opposite to the key mechanism viewpoint. If there is no key mechanism at all, then things are simple again. Things can be simple again, potentially, in this random way.
Actually, was probably in a cave somewhere in Hong Kong, an old Chinese playing a Chichironin or Koi Koi, who's very angry at your presentation because yes, he can manage
probably
the chaotic interaction with the dice.
if you use Kung Fu and
Yeah.
Maybe stupid question, but are you saying that if the dice are like tricky or
Piped? No, pipette, c'est mon français. Weighted, loaded dice. Loaded.
you will have a crazy probability distribution? That's what you're saying?
I mean, typically it will change the probability distribution, but it will not change the fact that it's still a probability distribution. Like it would be, let's say, if both dice are loaded to always fall on one, or to fall on one 80% of the time, then it will still, you will have a big peak at 2 here, at the sum of the 2. But whether you actually get one rather than something else will still depend on random factors, just much like less. But let's say there will still be nothing that you can do to make the dice. This is the nature of the dice, but they're still random in how they generate and understand. See what I mean? There's no way to draw them that will actually exploit that.
I guess the analogy would be that if you want to predict the outcome of a game of dice between two people, you don't need to know about their personal history or their skills because it's going to be random how they throw it. If now it's about basically a basketball game, then if you want to predict what's going to happen, you should know if they've been training or you need more information.
Yeah, typically, if both players are using the same loaded dice, the result will still be random who wins, right? No matter how loaded they are. Unless they always give exactly one, in which case it's a draw. So that's, I guess, my first story for why randomness does matter and does appear in the world. It's what I would call high dimensionality, which is many factors coming together create something that is effectively random. And I would say it's the same with species interactions. When species can really be ordered along a few key axes, like body size, then let's say here you have different species, they're ordered along one trait, then you would expect that their interaction matrix is in some sense ordered. Like here there was a nice, I maybe not so subtly influenced the existence of this axis yesterday night. But yeah, that's called foreshadowing. It was all according to plan. Whereas if you can imagine that each interaction between two species is the result of 10,000 different things, like herbivores, chemicals in the soil, light, water, whether you grow faster, and now you can generate something like metabolism, whatever. It's very possible that each interaction in this matrix has a value that is kind of independent of the others, because it all comes from a different combination of many factors. And then this is effectively a random matrix. Even though we could go into at each number and explain what this number is, what it is, all the results that come from this matrix would still be like a random matrix. Of course, this is again an idealization. It's not necessarily true that we're in either world. Maybe we're in between. A completely different reason to consider randomness. So that was my kind of principle. Like the world does generate randomness potentially. Like it happens in many fields. It could happen in ecology. Even if you don't really care about randomness as an object, even if you don't care whether it really happens in the world, it's still a useful tool. And so that's why I was talking about null models, right? Potentially, even if there wasn't a single random network in the world, it would still be useful to use randomness as kind of starting point for null models. Because I have an argument for this. And again, it's a bit of a vague argument. But you can decide, basically I'm giving you two stories, because maybe you will be convinced by one, maybe you will be convinced by the other, maybe you will hate both. But at least I will have tried. And that's my job. It's not really my job. But okay, basically, if you come back to this idea of non-model, here, let's say this is a abundance distribution. We said before there are many models that could generate the same abundance distribution, potentially. Then maybe some models will generate very special abundance distributions. Like you have a model that will generate an abundance distribution with 2 peaks or 3 peaks, or let's say one big peak, one small peak, and then it looks like a camel, or I don't know, whatever. That's not what camels look like, but it's fine. So in principle, you could say each model, gives a different outcome. And if I want to know if my mechanism is important for the outcome, I should try 50 different models and say, is my model special? Does it predict this outcome better than the others? Than all the 50 others, right? But here, randomness, the thing that is useful is that a random model would typically give you the outcome that 50 other models would have given you, most of 50 other models would have given you. Like, randomness usually follows the consensus opinion. What this means is, basically, yeah, no, I think that's all I have to say about it. That's what it means. So, I mean, it's not always true, it doesn't have to be true, but it's typically what will happen. So if you want to know if your mechanism is important, if your mechanism is the best explanation or the only explanation for this, rather than go to many other models, you can just compare to a random model, the right random model, hopefully, and then you can answer this question, hopefully.
Yeah, but I completely agree with you, but I think you were saying before how when you use probability, you hide assumptions.
Yes.
Here, what you're doing when you're stating that is that somehow there's a way to uniformly sample any other models.
Right. So that's actually a point that I kind of forgot to make in the sprint. Is that basically that's the question of what is the right random model exactly? What is the right random model to compare to your model? And in a way, like what neutral theory, the comparison of neutral theory and maximum entropy, one thing they reveal, I will not explain technically, but one thing they reveal is if you have a mechanism in mind, if you have this explanation in mind, you can use this to try to figure out what is the best random model to use as a comparison. Like there is a principled way, like different assumptions on your random model could give different results, but there is, at least you can use assumptions on the random model that are consistent with the assumptions you're making in the mechanism, and that's the right way to randomize. This is hand wavy. We need to give you concrete examples for how to do this. If you ever want to use randomness in your work, come and talk to me. We will do that. Yes.
I still don't understand what you said, what Violeta was asking me for. Why, if your random model doesn't give you what you have with the model, why you still cannot assume that your structure is important?
So you mean if the random model?
If the random model gives you something different, why
yes.
is that not a proof
Right,
that your
okay.
structure matters?
Okay, so if you have a model that is here that gives something that is very different from the consensus, so the problem is it tells you that there is something in your model that is important here. But I guess the point I wanted to make with this was, first of all, you don't know what part of it is important. And second of all, you need to have done the right comparison. Like if you don't look at the right random model, then you could still be wrong. But if you look at the right random model and there is a difference, it doesn't mean that there is something. But it could be something stupid, like number of species, like something very, very basic that could be driving this difference. That is not really the thing you care about.
Right, but assuming that you did the right comparison, then yes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're more like you can get up to 90% certainty that unless you have forgotten something, that yes, your structure does not.
And it has also something to do with this philosophy of the null hypothesis testing.
Yeah.
That the null hypothesis is never rejected, but just you just put other model to be more important, but that doesn't mean that the null hypothesis is not true. Something also like.
I think there's definitely something like that in the fact that it's the same problem with all null hypothesis. If you compare it to a stupid null, then everything is significant all the time. Everything is always the important thing, right? So you have to find the null that is as close as possible to your mechanism without having the mechanism. And that's the thing that will really tell you this is what, okay, I have the right thing, right? It's kind of the ceteris paribus. Like you need to have isolated all the other aspects that could impact your result to really have the right null.
Then you can try different one or which one?
Well, it's arguable whether there is one right null random model or whether, I would say, practically speaking, you will never have the perfect null, so it's worthwhile always doing a bit of consensus, but at least it's a consensus between reasonably similar things or reasonably certain things. It's not unheard.
Thank
words, like magic words that stop you from thinking.
But you can invoke that.
Yeah. So that's exactly what I was told to never do. Like use magic words that stop people from thinking. Like this is optimal, or this is maximum entropy, or something like this. And then okay, I just accept this. I shut up. No. But I agree to do it for now because it's 10:34. But then let's talk. So the flip side actually of that story, and actually it's an important flip side if you ever do simulations with random numbers in them, is that random models tend to exhibit only generic behaviors, which means that drawing parameters at random, it doesn't mean that you're exploring all the possibilities. You will be missing all those special outcomes if you use a random model quickly. So you would think that, okay, I'm just exploring uniformly all my possibilities, but I'm not really. A random model is typically a generic model of generic things, not of exotic things. Okay. Yeah.
So maybe we can do that.
Okay.
I mean, I think that in physics we actually invoke this, that if something is random, is ergodic, and you are happy with that. So here you are saying the contrary. Maybe I mean I don't have those concepts fully in my head, but for me this is very strange.
Yeah. So it's really about the question of what it means to explore the possibilities. It's a very subtle question. Like I'll give you just one example. If you throw 10,000 coins, you could say I'm exploring all the possibilities of the values of the coins, but I'm exploring a single possibility for the average, for the sum of those coins. It will always be 5,000 heads and 5,000 tails, more or less, right? So even though, sorry?
I think the correct answer is more half and half.
Yeah, half and half. Yeah, exactly. So what I mean is that, like for each coin, you're exploring uniformly half and half of its possibilities. But if you look at the macroscopic property, you're actually exploring a very peaked value of the macroscopic property. And there could be very special structures, correlations in the things that would allow you to be here. And an example, I gave an example of this here, which is if you have a network of predator-prey interactions, and you just draw who is who at random, then basically everybody is in the same traffic level. You will never get that someone by chance is at traffic level 10 of a long chain. Those chains never happen, they're negligible in the mass of what you see. So in fact, you are exploring a lot of individual possibilities, but a single collective possibility.
Okay, so it's micro versus macro states.
Yeah. And that's one example of a more generic idea. Yeah, but yeah. So okay, those are my two stories. What do you want to say? Yeah, I'll say like 3 minutes about this and then I'll let you go run in the fields. So just to summarize my first story was about the fact that complex systems could really behave like randomness. My story 2 is about that even if they don't, then randomness is still a good way to have a comparison point to know if your mechanism matters. And finally, yeah, that's actually that ties to this axis of yesterday, so I will say something about this. Again, always time. So what I want to say is, when we do a model when we do a simulation model where we have 10,000 species, we know that we cannot access all those 10,000 numbers or 100 million numbers explicitly. So we're usually going to use randomness to fill in some of the blanks. What I want to say is that it's appropriate to model some kind of heterogeneity, like between, let's say, 10 different species of rodents. It's much less appropriate, even though actually here they're not random, they're quite ordered, but you could have used randomness for some things, that would be okay. It's much less okay to try to, like, randomness will never capture the difference between a plant and an insect. Like, this is a kind of heterogeneity of difference between things that is far beyond the scope of just drawing numbers at random. No matter how heterogeneous, how skewed the distribution, saying that you have a distribution in the first place, but you can just look at the histogram and forget about differences, is already saying that in some sense your species are a bit equivalent. Not identical, not equal, but they're equivalent in the same way that a rich person and a poor person are both people with wealth, with some amount of wealth. Like we have reduced them to some equivalence of that. And that's not true of differences between trans and insects. And in a sense, I would say that it's a bit the same criteria that you would use as the criteria that you use to say the species are in the same niche. They're in a sense similar enough that you could compare them, look at total biomass in that niche. So the situations in which you might want to use randomness are a bit of are horizontal situations. There are kind of a logical connection between those two ideas. Okay, maybe that's a bit over the top. I will just drop that, I think. And I will just say one last thing. That's my last point. So I have said basically that, okay, as you increase the number of factors that matter, from basically a basketball all the way to a dice, you go from simple order, from a single species, if you know there's only one species that matters, to a simple set of keystone species or a simple mechanism, to randomness if many things matter. And I guess the question is, okay, you will tell me ecology is always in the middle, so why do we care about either this or that? It doesn't help. And the thing I want to leave you with is that maybe that's my hope, that's my reason for hope, that things in the middle, in many cases, when they're not actually true complexity in the sense I defined at the start, they're basically just an interpolation. They're a mix of simple order and randomness. And I'll give you just one example of this. Okay, everything up to date here was basically not me making claims. I mean, it was me, obviously, but it was claims that are reasonably well understood in the literature. Here, this is me making a claim. I want to say this is not a consensus, but this is what I believe. And I hope that I will make you believe and you will make other people believe and you will always be believers. So my belief is that it's maybe not true in the real world, but at least when you do a simulation of a food web, it often happens that this looks like a complicated food web. There are many links, many species. Here I've made my life a bit easier because there are well-defined drift levels, but who is who in the drift level is not obvious at all. It happens that if I reduce this complicated food web to just 4 groups, where within each group, like interactions are random, but with different means and variances for the group. So I go from here 10,000 parameters to here effectively like 4 effective species, but they're not species, they're a group of random sufficiently similar species. Then I predict the same biomass per level, fraction of survivor, diversity, and so on and so forth. It's a case in which this model does not actually make such a big difference from randomness plus the minimal amount of order that you need. Here you need to put this. If you just randomize everything, you will get a very different result. But you have a closer null model, which is I don't randomize everything, I just randomize within a drift level. And then I do get the same results. And it's just based on means and variances. So I think it's worth trying. There's no guarantee that it will work in your models, but I think it's worth a try. My conclusion. First, I've been a bit late. Oh wow. Yeah, I wanted to remove things. I forgot to remove things. Okay. I just leave that up and thank you.
So how can you know what's the order that you need?
Just try. At this stage, just try. I hope that in 10 years I will have an answer to that. Because you know that I don't have an answer to that. Thank you.
It wasn't meant to be mean.
I'm trying to remember when we talked about the stories. I thought there was more stories in one than 2.
I had a third one was a bit confusing, but it's about really this idea that whenever you would think about horizontal things, that's also a good reason to think about randomness. That story 3 was kind of absorbing that thing.
And just about systems with a lot of noise in them, is that not really?
You mean extrinsic? Yeah, I always felt that it was a bit of a cop-out, but why not?
No, I don't know. I really wonder if it's not a system. It just makes me wonder what you guys were saying, or you playing the false dichotomy about the versus neutral theory versus so-called niche, whatever, which I don't care about the name, but I mean, is it not a question of that you can roughly do it as a dichotomy because either you have strong noise overloading everything or you have weak noise and therefore you can get strong effective interaction and so on?
Sure. So yeah, I think if I can rephrase what you're saying, here we have a situation where populations are fluctuating a lot. And what I claim at some point is that you could get that from interactions creating chaos, or you could get that from an environment which is very chaotic, forcing you to behave like this. So either it could be from like really within the system or from outside the system. And in fact, indeed, those are two different ways that you could get something that's valid. I would also claim that potentially in neutral theory, this birth-death process, it's intrinsic to the system, but it's extrinsic to population dynamics. Like it's something that comes from the within species behavior rather than from species interactions. So you can have different sources of that random-like behavior. I think that was more or less what I was saying somewhere in here, but it's fine. Like, yeah, interesting verse. Yeah, I wanted to just, that was the connection between basically these weird fluctuations that you see. Are they because of the environment, so that would be like lecture 2 like, or are they because of intrinsic feedbacks, and that would be lecture 3 like? So again, where does Sefer wait now? Okay, that's all. We can go to coffee.
Maybe we can take a group picture.
Ah, yeah, group picture.
Yeah. Outside. That's not what you